Immigration has been on the forefront of European politics in recent years, as well as American politics. Debates about the failures of multiculturalism have dominated discourse in many countries throughout Europe. What effect have these sweeping immigration policies had when it comes to culture, freedom, and women's rights? Joining me to discuss all of this is activist, research fellow at the Hudson Institute, and author of the new book, Pray, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. AYAAN HIRSI Ali joins me. Thank you for being here. I want to start with a line from the book. You write, it's one of the rich ironies of early 21st century history that the single decision that has done the most harm to European women in my lifetime was made by a woman. You were referring to German President Angela Merkel and her decision in 2015 to do away with a limit on the number of asylum seekers who could come into Germany. How did that decision harm European women?
I think the decision wasn't based on a policy. It wasn't thought through. It was done on the spur of the moment, spontaneously, and it was driven by compassion. So I want your viewers to understand that Chancellor Merkel was actually acting, she was empathizing. She was driven by compassion. But the outcome, the unintended consequence of that moment was that some of the European neighborhoods and streets were flooded with men who come from countries with hostile attitudes to women. And some of them started acting out on those streets. And there are innocent women in Europe, regardless of skin color or age or what they wear, who are subjected to humiliating behavior, catcalls, sexual harassment, rapes, and worse. And again, I repeat, it wasn't her intention for this outcome to be, but it's important for leaders to know.
Yeah, well, this is a particular interest because Joe Biden just raised the asylum seekers, the limits of asylum seekers here in the United States. He's also basically thrown open the border walls in the United States. In the book, you point out that almost 3 million people have arrived in Europe illegally since 2009, close to 2 million in 2015 alone, according to your book. A majority have come from mostly Muslim countries. 2/3 of those recent immigrants, as you mentioned, are male and under 35. Now, this is on top of the legal immigrants who've already come. Why do you say this poses a threat to women's rights? How so?
It poses a threat because the existing immigrants, and sometimes even their children, from some of the countries that I describe in the book, were not assimilated or failed to assimilate on many different fronts, one of which is women's rights. And the problem of treating or mistreating women, a lot of European leaders thought that it would only be limited to quote unquote their women. So if Muslim communities mistreated Muslim women according to their religion and custom, people were prepared to look away. But now that whole thing is spilling over onto the streets and into the public space. And in some ways, the streets of Sweden, for instance, some women will say, are no different from the streets of Cairo when it comes to how men treat women. And some of these men, they come from countries like the one I come from, Somalia. They come from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria. In any of those countries, women who live there are used to a great deal of hostility and misogyny. But the European women, at least since the late 1950s, are not. And so you are seeing this type of thing play itself out on the streets of Europe. And some of these countries and their leaders are pretending as if all religions are the same, all cultures are the same. It's just a bit of a nuisance. It will go away, and it's not going to go away. More people are coming.
AYAAN, you are an academic. Do you see the problem of honest dialogue here in the U.S., where we have a woke culture and political correctness keeping people from speaking out about issues like race and religion and culture?
Yes, I see the development of what we call in Europe multiculturalism developing here in the United States. And yes, it goes by the name critical theory, critical race theory, woke. I think woke is one of the more names, labels that people are familiar with. And I see the development of that, and it's affecting issues such as immigration. At first, you would think it would be limited only to race relations here in America, but it's affecting all sorts of topics. And so, yeah, that's a terrible development. And I think the woke movement is one that should be exposed, and we should push back against them, not follow their ideology.
You write in the book, it's not enough for immigrants simply to learn the rudiments of local language and get menial jobs. They must also be willing to adopt the values of the country that has given them asylum. The obligation of government is to see to it that immigrants are familiarized with those values and that they are taught by instructors who appreciate what is at stake. How can countries like Germany, France, Sweden, the U.S. go about ensuring that this happens? And why hasn't it been done so far?
It hasn't been done so far because of all of these ideologies we've been talking about: multiculturalism, moral relativism, postmodernism. There were so many people within the leadership circles who would put any obstacle that you can think of to stop these programs in their tracks. There were also the organized Islamist groups who were telling their community members not to assimilate, not to integrate, and to reject the norms and values of the host society. But now things are changing. If you look at what's happening today in France, one of the arguments we used to hear all the time was, well, if we take these issues out of the taboo sphere and we discuss them openly, then the far right, extreme right groups are going to be the beneficiaries of that debate. Well, everything remained taboo, and Front National in France is now the second largest party. And if you look at the polls, there is a possibility that they could win the elections next year. So Macron, who is an establishment politician and in the middle, has in fact developed a bill that today has gone through their parliament, what we would call the House here, and only has to go through the Senate. And that bill deals with what he calls separatist Islamist groups and communities in France. So it's going to happen anyway, if it happens, if we're fortunate. But it's going to happen after many terrorist attacks, after so many women have been assaulted and raped, after we've shut down, after a lot of human suffering. And it's always a puzzle to me why, if we can anticipate problems coming, why we don't take action when in fact that action is at its most effective.
AYAAN, before I let you go, what do you make of Pope Francis's outreach to Islam? Next week, he's going to Iraq. He has plans to meet with Iraq's top Shiite Muslim cleric, Ali al-Sistani. Is Islam at all interested in dialogue with other faiths? Will this ever work?
Islam as it is today, unchanged and with an attitude of supremacy to all other religions and faiths. I think that Islam and the people who represent that Islam are obviously not interested in dialogue. I think the Pope is wasting his time. I think the Pope could say, I will come and have a dialogue once you make changes, and he could then put on the table what changes he would like to see made. I think the Pope should be talking about the plight of Christian minorities in Muslim countries, the plight of women and homosexuals in Muslim countries and how they're treated. And just going there and, shaking hands for a photo op, I think that won't cut it.
AYAAN HIRSI Ali, I thank you for being here. The book is Pray, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online. AYAAN, thank you.
Raymond, thank you for having me.